Okay, it's mainly the coin reunion company. Yes, that's right. Exactly. I'm not quite sure where to find it. Oh, there it goes. Okay, we're live. Okay, thanks for coming. It's mostly coin folks, so that's good. Did any of you work on the UNICEF project? No? Okay. So this will be new for you folks. The kind of most interesting thing is we're working with UNICEF to set up another startup. It's called SALA CM, and so that's why you're seeing the new email address. So we're going to talk a little bit about our history of working with UNICEF on this particular project called Primero. I'm going to try to go over, what the problem was that we're trying to solve, a little bit of the history, and the thing that should be of most interest to the Linux community is what's the lesson learned for trying to apply open source for global, for social good types of application, humanitarian. And then a little bit about the future of where UNICEF is going with this and where we're trying to take it as well. So hopefully everyone knows UNICEF, pretty widely recognized. It's part of the UN. Its mission is to provide humanitarian and development aid for children, and they expand it to women. So those are their two target markets. They've been working since 1949 formally. So they've been around a long time, and you can see that for their practices are very well established. They're in 100 countries. Their mandate is to provide both emergency relief and development assistance. Development assistance is more recent, and that's actually going to have a big impact in talking about Primero, where we're trying to take it. Its budget is pretty massive at $10 billion, so it's a very substantial organization. All the money is voluntarily donated. The bulk of it is from governments, but individuals can contribute. Folks probably have seen the UNICEF Christmas cards types of donations. There's a governance board that made up of a bunch of different NGOs. They have besides the executive board, they have 7 regional offices that cover different territories like Africa, Central America. And then every country has its own board. It's at the country level that all the work actually gets done, except for big initiatives like Primero. The other interesting thing, just to go back here, is UNICEF doesn't actually carry out any of the tasks. They just are a coordinator providing funds often. They don't actually execute on a lot of the programs. It's either the governments or NGOs that do the actual work in the field. And that's absolutely critical for the kind of software we're going to be talking about here. So I think their mission is great. Consider donating on every presentation we talk about doing this. It's a very impressive organization. The people we work with are really dedicated and work in some of the hardest areas that you can imagine. So that's a little bit about UNICEF. The focus here is on a program called Primero. It's an initiative that UNICEF started about a decade ago to try to replace the paper-based approaches and all the homegrown systems and proprietary systems that were coming up, trying to unify it, provide a modern platform that would work in the kind of situations they have to face. It's essentially a case management system, but targeted towards children, support of children. Initially, it was focused on refugee management. Now we're looking more at long-term development kind of support as well. They had a few basic ideas. They wanted to make this a digital public good, something that could be used not only by UNICEF, but across the UN and across other NGOs. It's intended to be a platform for social welfare, humanitarian development workers. That's the target users. And it's intended to facilitate case management, incident monitoring. So, when, say, the Ukraine crisis right now, that's a perfect example. A child arrives at the border, no parents, no family. How do you get them reconnected with their family? That's what Primero is targeting and trying to solve that problem. They have a website that's worth visiting. So what is it exactly? So as I said, it's a case management system primarily. So it's collection of information about primarily children, women, for other types of applications. Like we have another user that's using it for in the cocoa fields in Africa to try to track child labor abuse situations. So same kind of thing. We're capturing information about the child. We have workflows that try to capture what we're doing to try to find the families, and in terms of family reunification. And right now what it's doing is replacing paper systems, people scribbling on the back of a notebook or spreadsheets. Excel is very, very popular in this area, and a lot of legacy systems. And by legacy, I mean kind of one-off things. Some of them are actually fairly modern. But they're one-off systems used by one NGO for one particular application. UNICEF envisioned Primero as replacing all of these and having a single system that the community could get behind and share the development costs and maintenance costs. The idea was to try to handle the full life cycle, so it's arrival at the border of the child, registering, assessment, you're planning how you're going to do the reunification, even up to providing resources, identifying housing, identifying schooling, things like that. An example of this is where Primero is deployed in Jordan for the refugee camps from the Syrian crisis. And that's been going on for how long now? Almost 10 years there itself. So they're using it to help manage the situation in the refugee camps as we speak. An essential part of Primero, since it was intended to be a general system for handling multiple kinds of social welfare situations, it's a configuration system. This is also critical because it's deployed in many different countries. I think we're in about 60 countries now, close to that. Then you multiply that by the number of languages that we're supporting. It's 25 or something. We have 5 or 6 distinct dialects of Arabic, just for Arabic alone. It's very, very impressive how flexible it is, and it's through what we call the configuration system. There's several different primary components around this. There's the Primero core itself that provides the basic management services that's available. Then we have a module that's for child protection, another for gender-based. Remember I said the protection of women is a core part of the UNICEF mission. And then other modules are depending on the types of NGOs and their mission. So I mentioned child labor in the cocoa fields. That's an example of a recent one that was developed. About over 50 organizations are currently using Primero, so it's very widely used at this point. UNICEF has invested, and its partners have invested a lot of money, $12 million plus and counting, on this over a 10-plus year development life cycle. It's in about 60 countries. It's kind of roughly the map that's there. And the yellow part is going to be the important part for the future, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We have about 10K users, and by the users, these are the caseworkers. That's who we're talking about. It's not the children. Okay, the children, God knows how many children we've served, but it's an astonishing number at this point. And when I go through the history of where it's been used, it's kind of incredible the types of situations it has to go in. The best way to think about it, in fact, is if you read about a crisis in the news, Primero is almost certainly going to be there. That's basically where it gets deployed. And that gets to this one. It's really built. It's a tank in terms of reliability, protection, data protection. We're working in fields that it's kind of incredible to even think of if you're just a regular software developer. We're typically in conflict zones or disaster zones. Those are the two types of scenarios we're typically in. As I said, we're going to be trying to get more into the development support things, but right now that's where Primero is primarily used. So the types of situations we're facing is there's very poor infrastructure, including very poor connectivity, so everyone assumes wireless access or cell phone coverage. We cannot assume that for Primero. You have to be able to do everything offline. There's often very minimal government or social support services available. So UNICEF generally has an in-country team. They'll bring in the NGOs to provide the actual assistance, but they almost always want to pair that with governments, and it can get very challenging. And that's the fourth point here. We want to do that, but when you start bringing in the kind of money that some of these crises require, you just run into corruption. And we'll see when we talk a little bit about the history, this has really caused some problems for the development of Primero. And then probably the saddest part of this is there's a lot of bad actors. The Syrian crisis is a perfect example of that. So a child comes to the border, we're collecting a lot of information, where they lived, who their parents are, who their cousins and extended family. The Syrian government would love to get that information and try to track them down. So we have to protect against that. When we talk a little bit about the future thing, this comes up all the time because UNICEF has to work across the entire world environment. So if we're hosting in one country, whose laws do we follow? It gets very challenging. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the technology. This is basically the only slide. It's a tech stack that Primero inherited actually from an earlier project. It's a progressive web app based on React Redux. The backend server is Ruby on Rails. Currently is using Postgres as its main database. We almost always deploy on Linux, and we deploy both in-country and hosted. Traditionally, we've done in-country, And some situations it's required. The government will just simply mandate that. And in some situations you have to have it. And it's an open source project hosted on GitHub. Anybody can check it out. And there are quite a few contributors. I think there's about 200 contributors, about 50 forks used by other NGOs and countries, even like Pakistan has a fork of its own that they're using internally. So the reason why I'm not going to focus too much on the technology is that the success of Primero really is not based on what tech stack we're using. It's much more on the organization behind it and all the processes that have been put in place. So UNICEF has stood up supporting infrastructure for this. There's a steering committee that's kind of headed up by UNICEF, but there's other partners with that. UNHCR is a major contributor. And then NGOs like Terre d'Homme, a Swiss NGO, Child Protection, AOR is another, and a long list of additional ones. These are some hopefully more well-known. We're actively working with more NGOs to bring them on board. The main idea, though, is it's just not the UN and UNICEF. We're getting a whole group of NGOs participating in this. And at the UNCF level, it's governments primarily. The UN structure essentially is involved there. They have extensive documentation that's available online, freely available, again, open source, that tries to establish best practices. So you got to think of the situation we're in. We have this cool software, case management. We go to Sierra Leone, it's chaos. No one's ever heard of case management. We have to not only bring the software there, but we have to teach the people. This is what case management is. This is the kind of information we have to gather. These are the processes we have to follow. All that is incredibly important. And if you don't get that right, it doesn't matter how good your software is. The thing that UNICEF emphasizes is you have to have in-country support. So when we would deploy, Coin, the company that I'm part of, we helped develop Primero. We had to send our developers to countries. So we went to Ethiopia, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Syria. Any conflict zone you can think of, our developers were there on the ground, doing the installation, teaching the system admins, and then UNICEF would have NGOs that would go through the same process for the NGOs. That last point is really the critical point for making this successful. Okay, so a little bit about the history. So 10 years now, 10 years plus going. We're going to see that it's a pretty painful process. A lot of starts and stops, driven by just how the UN works, honestly. The kind of key takeaways I hope to make is individuals really made the difference in this project. One or two people kept it going when the funding disappeared, to the next tranche of funding came and could continue the development and support of that. And that's the last point. You have to be quite clever here. And I know this is an issue in open source community. We have core parts of the internet, for example, that it's hard to get support for to maintain and extend and enhance. And Primero is certainly an example of that. So we had to find opportunities, in quotes there, because by an opportunity, it's like the Ebola crisis comes out. It's a horrible situation, but there's a ton of funding coming in, and we could try to use that to extend and enhance Primero. So here's how it got started. So in 2009, Columbia University had a class on trying to apply technology for social good. And it was a hands-on kind of class, and the class itself developed an application called Rapid FTR, Tracing and Reunification. It's exactly what UNICEF does. Around the same time, there was a group at UNICEF called UNICEF Innovation, staffed by one particular person who really had the idea of developing digital public goods, things that software primarily and infrastructure that could be used across all of the UN and UNICEF in particular. And they found out about Rapid FTR and say, hey, we could use this for our mission. And they started that way. And UNICEF got some grants to get started, pulled it in, and was assessing how they could possibly use it. So once it was brought in, they issued an RFP. ThoughtWorks was the company that won that RFP, and they took Rapid FTR, made it, it was remember, this was a class project, so they tried to make it a little more robust for the kind of application it was going to go in. And they first deployed to Uganda. There wasn't a severe crisis at that point. They were seeing it more as a test of it. And it went actually fairly well. Initially deployed on BlackBerries and Androids because of connectivity issues, and it captured all the information that way. And they were encouraged to continue, so a little more funding came in. And at that point, they tried to deploy to a real situation, real crisis situations, Sudan Civil War at that time, and then in the Philippines, if you folks remember, the terrible earthquake followed very shortly by the horrible typhoon that inundated. They tried to bring it into there, and it was just not ready. Both technically, there were some issues with the software, and more the infrastructure and all the surrounding support that I spoke about just wasn't there. They didn't really understand at that point what it would take. So they went back. They didn't give up on the idea, though. At that point in 2013, they hired Robert McTavish, and if there's one individual that's made Primero what it is, it's Robert. He's a child protection officer. He put together, he saw this project, he says, I think this is the right way to go, we just need to make it more robust. And he issued a new RFP, which morphed Rapid FTR into Primero, and Primero was born. So it's really about 2013 that the concept of Primero came out. Most of the funding came from the U.S. government as a grant from USAID, $500K, so a good chunk of change for a project at the UN. And we development started. While that was happening, Rapid FTR was still going in parallel. There was two concepts going on. One, we had to rethink this all over, develop a new system called Primero. Another group of folks said, well, Rapid FTR is okay, we just need to enhance it. So they came out with version 2. They went out to Sudan, the civil war in Sudan at that time. And again, utter chaos, horrible infrastructure, no government support. NGOs are terrified to go there. So it's not just the software, again, it's the whole environment. And that did not go well. And that was really kind of the end of Rapid FTR. It still kept going for a while, but it was more or less baked in at that point. 2015, we the first release of Primero went out into GitHub, we kept, the approach we took on this is we kept the same basic architecture of RapidFTR, but made it robust. That was a critical thing. We had to make sure that it could work in the field in a real-world environment and not in an academic classroom. And that actually was considered a big success, just that part, because there was a lot of goodwill generated. We pushed the changes back. We didn't say what you did was crap. We got to start all over, which is a typical kind of reaction. And because of that, we got a lot of kudos from the RapidFTR folks and other groups within the UN. The other part, and this is what Robert really did at UNICEF, he understood that you also needed to put in the processes in place, and that was stood up at the same time. So he developed a system like this whole approach. When we deploy, the developers go out into the field as well. That was Robert's really idea. Our first deployment of Primero was in Jordan for the Syrian civil war. Kenya, that was the famine and conflict. There's always conflict. Somalia, probably one of the more interesting trips we had. We landed in the airport, and we never left the airport. All of those went reasonably well, given the scenario, and considered a success. We then went to Nepal, and I think Nepal was an earthquake. I can't quite remember what the situation was there. But funds had run out by then, and there were some, again, governmental NGO types of issues that made it difficult there, and that one was not that great. And this is going to be the history of this. We have a pretty good deployment, we follow up with a deployment not so good, and we keep going like that. And the other part of the history here, with I think a lot of open source projects face this too, is funding. How do you keep a steady stream of funding? The UN in particular, and UNICEF even more so, it's very reactive. When things are going good, no money. And then big thing comes up, and then a ton of money comes out. And both of those things are really bad. When you have no money, your development team goes away, essentially. We actually didn't go. My current company, Coin, who developed Primero, we had many years where we kept developing when we were not being paid anything. So we kept the team alive because we always thought we could get to the next tranche of funding. The inverse is also true. When you get a ton of money going to a poor country, corruption just goes crazy, and it eats up all the money, and they get a lot of bad will. And they say, well, this Primero is a corrupt institution and service, and no one wants to touch it after that. Next one, probably this was the scariest one, and in a lot of ways. We went to Sierra Leone in late 2015 for the Ebola crisis. There was a ton of money going there. But we ran into exactly this issue. The corruption was really very bad, and including at the country program level at UNICEF. So that was considered a failure, pretty clear. It was just very, very hard to make this successful. So again, emphasizing it's not the software, it's everything above it that really, really matters. While this was all going on, UNHCR and others, I'm just picking out UNHCR, they had developed their own system, and this continued on for quite some time. Parallel systems were being developed, one-off kinds of things. They were typically commercial. They would put out an RFP. In this case, it was an RFP. Microsoft won it, and they used Microsoft Dynamics to build it. they were focused more on development instead of crisis management, and they tried to deploy it to Jordan. Not too successful. There were actually, in this case, a lot of technical issues. The stack was causing issues. We then, Primero was already in Jordan. We then went back into Jordan to essentially replace the Microsoft Dynamics system with Primero. And it's interesting how a lot of these things work. It's a connection. So the Queen of Jordan was very supportive of this idea. And we had a local UNICEF officer who was absolutely a gem. He could always push it. He knew who to talk to. He knew where to get the money. And because of that, it was a very successful deployment, and this continued to be used. So we have Primero in Jordan for several different things. Development support work. The police are using it for some of their case management, and we're using it in the refugee camps in Jordan. I'm going to bring up a few other third parties independent of UNICEF. So Terre de Hommes is a Swiss-based NGO. They've been working in this area, child support, development support, crisis support for many, many years. And they actually took checked out, forked Primero, developed it completely on their own, added new modules, and deployed it on their own. It was very impressive, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So they went to Burkina Faso for that. I'm bringing this one up because they became part of the steering committee eventually. And this is really the vision that the UNICEF had 10 years ago. They wanted to bring all different kinds of NGOs together. At the same time, we got a grant internally funded, which is very unusual at the UN. Again, Robert is key to making this happen, and a very substantial grant to develop Primero V2. So an enhancement mainly around making it more robust. So we put in, this is when we put in the progressive web app interface. We replaced CouchDB with Postgres. A lot of cleanup to make the code more robust, and adding more functionality in terms of case management. And that's the version that's being used in the field now. I think we've converted just about everybody over to V2 at this point. And then now, kind of future, and there's a lot more that I could say, but kind of the highlights here. The next big development is the idea of going to Primero, what we're calling Primero X, which is essentially a hosted solution. Everything I've spoken about up to now, we actually deploy in the field. So we bring a computer, put it on the plane, land in Somalia, and stand up that server and install Linux and put everything on. For a lot of reasons, we decided that's not a scalable model. So Primero X came up. We're trying to get this hosted, so crisis comes up, you hit a switch, and you have a new instance of Primero ready to go. That's the basic idea. Okay, main takeaways here. It's a rocky start, a lot of parallel projects going on at the same time. Funding is on, off, all the time. There's both successes and failures. So it's a very challenging history. But at the end, there's 10 years of development. We have a large group of NGOs that are working with UNICEF, governments. There's, I think, a real commitment now at this point. So what are the kind of lessons learned from something so challenging and complicated for trying to apply open source? Haven't focused too much on the open source nature of it, but here's where we'll start digging in a little bit. I think the things that really matter here is having dedicated leaders and the folks, we work with folks that really, really care about what they do, and that's what makes the difference. They're mission-driven. They don't care so much about the technology or that it's open source or proprietary. They really care about solving the problem, and that's really the key thing. And this always comes up because UNICEF is always being bombarded by primarily vendors saying, oh, we got a cool new shiny thing. This will solve all your problems. And every year there's something like that. And you want people that are focused on what's the solution I'm trying to do, and just, what's the most pragmatic, practical, and robust solution to this. The other big thing is making sure that you have stable teams that know the software and can continue to develop it over a long term. So the counter example of this, and the UN really suffered from this, is the whole RFP process. So you put something out to bid, someone comes and wins the bid, they develop it, they give it to you, and poof, they go away. No one's there to develop, support it, maintain it afterwards. So the UN is particularly susceptible to this, but this is like big corporate IT does this all the time too. They spin up big projects, and it finishes, and then they think they don't need anybody. It goes away. There's a fantastic book by Jennifer Pakla. She was the, I think, CTO or sub-CTO for the Obama administration for doing the big thing here is the healthcare.gov rollout. And she has a great book that I highly recommend. Anyone trying to apply open source for social welfare kinds of things, it's a fantastic book. And this is her one critical thing. You have to have stable teams that care about the software in the long run. And I think Primero, even though we had a lot of funding problems, we kept the team. The team that won the RFP is still the team that's running it now. The other thing that really matters a lot is you can have the best software in the world, but if you don't have the processes, the best practices, and someone on the ground holding the people's hands, showing them how to do it, it's just not going to work. And you have to, and you have to have the right people, because there's a lot of money going on. There's a lot of incentive for corruption. You have to be very careful. The other part, and most open source projects don't, thankfully, don't have to deal with that part of it, but the rest still matters, I think. The funding, trying to keep the projects alive, this is really critical, and again, Robert was amazing at this, how to keep the project limping along when we didn't have any funding source or no interest. This has always been a problem. Where open source really makes this interesting is in terms of the long-term viability of the project. What we ran into over and over working with the UN is they would develop a proprietary system and it just rot and go away. That's what happened. No one would be maintained. You couldn't see it. You couldn't maintain it. No one was working on it. The open source completely changes that model. You have visibility. Anyone can look at it. People are constantly contributing to it. It's a completely different mindset, and that's where the real value from a digital public good, if you want to say, okay, why is open source useful in this space? I think that's the one big thing. Things that matter a lot less, and I know some might be a little controversial, the particular technology you use, okay, there's better or worse, clearly. I have my own opinions, you have your own opinions. It really doesn't matter that much. What you're looking for are things that are stable, robust, long-term, maintainable, I think is the main thing. The other thing that this is endemic in our field, the next shiny thing syndrome. The UNICEF is constantly bombarded with vendors coming to them, and we get diverted all the time. Oh, there's this cool new thing, it will fix all these problems, please, here's a bunch of money, put it in, and then we spend 6 months, and poof, they go away, and the next shiny thing comes up, and over and over and over. You have to have someone that has some, just as pragmatic, saying, okay, this is cool, but is it useful for us, kind of thing. And then just because you have open source doesn't mean it's going to be successful. You got to have the infrastructure and support. And the open source community is sometimes maybe a little weaker in this area than some commercial organizations. So think of like Google, the budgets they have to maintain their systems and their infrastructure. It's open source can never match that really, and we don't really try. So again, that emphasizes a lot more. Try to focus on the core things. Don't get diverted too much because you just don't have the budget to do that. Okay, a little bit about the future now. Primero is fairly stable. Funding is always an issue. we're still struggling with that. But we know there are two main things that UNICEF and the steering committee are focused now. The first one is going to a crisis situation and expecting Sierra Leone to be able to manage something like this is not realistic. So and it doesn't matter if it's open source or proprietary, it's the same kind of problem. The other part that we thought of putting it on GitHub and expecting someone, an NGO to check it out and enhance it and deploy it and build it, even just build it, is not realistic. Now some have, like Tail Dome, but there was one guy that was really, really good and he did all the work at Tail Dome. In general, that's not realistic. The other part is, as I said, how do we get a more, it's not so much the exact amount of money, it's more these peaks and troughs that are so hard to work through. So what we're looking for is stable, long-term funding source. That's really what we care. And it's not the absolute amount that's as critical, but that it's stable. So the steering committee is looking at two different areas for this. One is going to hosted solutions, kind of the obvious thing nowadays. It's a bit the next shiny thing, so you have to be a little careful of this. We get a ton of pressure from the hosting companies. Microsoft is constantly pushing Azure, or Google is pushing Google Cloud, so there's a bit of danger there. But the solution clearly is what's needed here. This provides what we have. We can turn on a new instance very quickly, assuming you have a good enough infrastructure in the host country to be able to get connectivity. So that's still a problem. The other part is to try to take Primero and bring it to a larger market. or larger group of users or needs, social welfare needs. And in particular, we're thinking about the domestic US, Canadian, Mexico market, at least initially. So as I said, we're developing we're working with UNICEF now, developing something called Primero X. It's essentially Primero hosted currently on Azure. The tricky thing here, so doing the hosting is fairly straightforward, nothing terribly complicated technology-wise. The big problem with UNICEF and situation, any social welfare type of application, is how do you respect the privileges and immunities? So the thing that UNICEF is dreads is getting a demand from a bad actor country saying, please give me all the information you have about person X, family Y, and what protections does UNICEF have against? Once it's a hosted solution, that becomes vastly easier to lose that information. And that's why self-hosting within a country is never going to go away for Primero, because there's some situations you just can't trust the host country or all the surrounding countries or the hosting company. They selected Microsoft for the hosting provider because they provided the strongest guarantees of living up to privileges and immunities. Yeah, and exactly how much you can trust that. And we've had long discussions about this. But that's the big problem with Primero X. The other part is we're trying to get into a mode of making this something that's available continuously and not just for crisis situations, where it could be used for development support as well. And the term that we're using for that is technology for development. The thing that I'm most excited about and directly impacts my company is we're starting up another company, Salas CM. It's a US-based company that's going to take the Primero platform and bring it to the US domestic market. We're targeting it kind of like Primero X as hosted solution or SaaS offering. We're targeting the situations I've faced here, so it's a different scale of badness, obviously, but we're looking at social health care types of situations, so drug abuse, homelessness. We do have refugees, clearly, if we had if you remember the border situation during the Trump administration when they were separating the children, there was a whole problem of reunifying them, and that's still not a solved problem. We could have helped there. And the State Department actually came to UNICEF and said, could we use Primero? But for a lot of reasons, they didn't at that time. We are organized as a for-profit, and part of that is to provide a stable base of money and support for the UNICEF and maintaining Primero as well. So this is quite a sea change for UNICEF. UNICEF is a partner on this. They're unlikely to become a shareholder for a lot of reasons, but they are on the board as an example. And we're working directly with them, and from their point of view, what we're going to be doing is providing ongoing, stable, long-term support for Primero that they could then use for their own mission. And that's it. This has been something, as I said, an important part of COIN. I can't say we've made a ton of money on this project, but it's been a very satisfying project, and it's. I think we made a difference and helped a lot of children and women over those 10 years. So we're pretty happy with our contribution, and we're really excited about taking it to the next step to the U.S. market. Okay. Any question? Yeah.
Is there a microphone? They always want question askers to.
Well, ask a question, he can repeat it. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So it seems to me that you're talking about getting consistent funding being a problem, and maybe the solution to that is to have, like, it being used consistently rather than being pushed into those, like big problem areas.
And that's what Silas is about.
Well, there's two parts to that.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, the funding is a problem. Everyone recognizes it. It seems like part of it is we're reactive for crisis situations, and it would make more sense to keep it long-term. And that's exactly, I may not have communicated, but that's exactly what UNICEF is trying to do. Get away from crisis management to development, and have Primero essentially stood up permanently in all the major countries that need this kind of capability.
Little crisis is like there's flooding somewhere in Appalachia.
Exactly. You could, you turn it on, it's already there, so you may have to do some configuration, but you're ready to go. That is exactly the idea, yeah.
Do you collect biometric data? Because I'm thinking like a toddler or a child that is 4 or 5 years old, they look differently when they hit 7, 8.
Yeah. So the question was, do we collect biometric data on children? Currently, we are not. In some situations, we do some basic things, but mostly, no, we don't. It is one of the most challenging parts of the reunification process, is gathering enough information to be able to identify who are your real parents, because a toddler isn't going to know what village they came from or what their parents' names are. It's mommy and daddy or the equivalent. So this is what the case managers know about. They know this problem. They work with this day in and day out. This issue of biometrics constantly comes up. This is one of the shiny things that often we eventually will probably have to provide it. There's a lot of hesitancy in many of the countries to do that, though. So we got to balance it and be very, very careful on that.
How does discovery work? So children or the people arriving at the border obviously discover UNICEF and Primero because they're brought into the system at the point they hit the border. But how do the parents or people, how do they even know it exists? How do they know to look?
So the question was on discovery. So a child arrives at the border, they have the child, but how does the family reach out to us, to UNICEF, to help? And this is part of the process. So we actually have very good documentation and guidelines. What do you need to set up? So it's like putting posters in the different refugee camps saying, we may have your child, please contact us here, kind of thing. And remember, these people, they don't have cell phones. There's no internet cafe. There's nothing at all. So it's a lot of on the ground, boots on the ground, talking to people, saying, trying to get the information to them, but also collecting that information. And that's what Primero does, essentially. You're on your tablet or mobile device or computer, and you're talking to a person right there in the field and trying to get that, and then we try to make the connections. A child roughly this age, this height, this kind of color in their hair, all kinds of physical characteristics. and also where they were found, who brought them in, what language did they speak. Remember I said that we have many, many variants of Arabic. That matters a lot for identification because some dialects are only spoken in certain regions, so that helps a lot right away. Hey, Greg.
So I understand that the tech stack is not so important, but we want to know. So you said Ruby on Rails and React Redux, Postgres. So on my Android tablet, I'm in a browser, and do you save a lot of data locally when the network's not there?
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, we go over again that the tech stack's not that important, but how do we actually do things in the field when you're on your phone, you're not connected, what is the tech stack doing? Yeah, we do cache quite a bit of information locally. We're using the browser-based, for the most part, the browser-based databases and APIs for that. And then we have a big part of Primero is the synchronization. When you do get connectivity, how do you sync up? We do not capture too much information on the phone because there is some concern of loss of information if that phone gets acquired by a bad actor. So there is, we're hesitant of putting too much there. We prefer to put it on the host where there's more controls and protection long term. This is one of the most challenging parts. How do we protect that information in the field when there's just one person there and prevent it from leaking out to bad actors? Does that answer the question, Greg?
So if you're in a situation where you have a troubled relationship with the host country, how are you protecting that data, especially if you're hosting locally? I mean, I'm sure encryption, but you know, if they threaten to start breaking these.
Yeah. So take the Syrian crisis, refugee crisis, as an example of that. So the sponsor for Primero there is the Jordanian government. So the servers for the Syrian situation are actually hosted in facilities managed and run by the Jordanian government. We went in and helped stand them up. We gave them, best practices on how to secure. We stood up a Linux server. We showed them how to configure it properly, and then we gave them best practices around securing it. And then they obviously have their own standards there. At the end of the day, UNICEF is dependent on them providing the appropriate level of security. Remember at the very beginning, I said UNICEF really doesn't execute on any of this. They try to plan and coordinate. We rely on the people on the ground and governments on the ground to actually implement a lot of this. There is concern about that, and that another reason for Primero X. We think we could have a maybe not more secure, but consistently more secure environment if it's hosted by us. Because we don't run audits on what the Jordanian government is doing, in other words.
Do you typically rely on, what is the SpaceX network?
Starlink?
No. Kind of situations?
We have done any and all of the above kind of situation. It's highly dependent on the situation. In Africa, the wireless network is actually the most reliable infrastructure there, and that's what we ended up using. For the Ukrainian crisis, I'm actually not that knowledgeable, but I would expect that Starlink is an important part of there. Ukrainian is a little bit different because the host countries are all the surrounding countries around Ukraine. So, they're they're wealthy countries with good infrastructure and good processes and very low levels of corruption. So it's a very different kind of situation for Ukraine. So we wouldn't worry too much. This is, we keep saying the next shiny thing, but this is something we thought a lot about on how do we do better communications in very challenging environments, and we've worked with a lot of different players. We haven't come up with just one solution at this point.
Yeah, people with communication methods, they become targets because the communication is important. So now they become targets, so you have to limit that.
Yep, so the comment, this was more a comment, in the field, the providers of the communication channel become the targets for bad actors, and that's absolutely right. You have to think through all these points. And it's not only the bad actors, but they're also susceptible to bribery and all kinds of things that you may not think of right away in most open source projects.
FYI, the recording stops in less than 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you.
How difficult is it to find engineers that are willing to travel?
You know,
What's the experience like?
yeah, so the question was, how do you find developers, or how difficult is it to find developers willing to go to these challenging